Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 45th week of 2015. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via the good folks at Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Szoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's November 6th. On this day in 1943, the army of the Soviet Union captured Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Before withdrawing, the German army destroyed most of the city's ancient buildings. On this day in 1944, plutonium was produced at the Hanford Atomic Facility in the state of Washington and used in the Fat Man atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. On this day in 1962, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning South Africa's apartheid policies and calling for all UN member states to cease military and economic relations with that nation. Compare the rather different treatment of what has been called the worse apartheid in the territories illegally occupied by Israel 5 years later. On this day in 1963, General Duong Van Minh became dictator of South Vietnam following the November 1st coup and execution of President Ngo Dinh Diem, arranged by the Kennedy administration. Today, another book featured in liberal circles like Democracy Now! Tries again to shift blame to the king's evil advisors for the Vietnam War, in this case the CIA and its head, Allen Dulles. Why this need to exculpate Kennedy and, in parallel, I think, Obama today? Does it have to do with the fact that U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians, and continue to do so for the profits of the 1%? We have a bit of a bad conscience about that, I think, and want to say it isn't so. So you're watching News from Neptune, a Daddy Didn't Do It edition, but he did. And we'll start with David Green.
Thanks. I'm going to mention briefly that one of the difficult things about entering a race and getting a couple of phone calls from journalists is that you have to speak sort of extemporaneously, and even though they did a good job of repeating my talking points, I'm going to correct a couple of things that I might have said but didn't say. I
should have mentioned, David, that as the News Gazette said yesterday, you are planning to run on the green ticket for the state senatorial seat from this district, right?
Yes, I'm going to try to collect the signatures to run as a Green Party candidate for the 52nd Senate District. Tom Kasich did a good interview with me, I think, and wrote a good article. The article actually online had a little extra paragraph there reflecting the last question he asked me. And the question he asked me was, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, do you think that your candidacy will hurt either major party? and you know, a lot of times it's hard to think on your feet. And I just basically said, no, I don't think about that. Although what I really should have said, and what I'm going to use News from Neptune to do a sort of correction, a sort of wish I would have said segment on News from Neptune, and what I wish I would have said was the two major parties are hurting at least 90% of the people of this country.
Right.
Why would I worry about hurting them?
Hear, hear.
And similarly, not quite the same. I had an interview, a phone interview this morning that you may, if you listen to WILL, you may be hearing bits and pieces of in the coming days or maybe next week, and by a woman named Hannah Meisel, and she asked me during our interview, which was a little difficult because the line wasn't great. She asked me, what about the business climate? What about Governor Rauner's concern about the business climate? And I kind of, I said some things that I usually say in response to things like that, like, well, their idea of the business climate is to make more profits, and we would have a better business climate if we paid people well, if people had money in their pockets, and they could actually spend money at businesses. And I think a better way might, on reflection, a better thing for me to have responded, or a good talking point in this regard would be, well, are we concerned about the business climate, or are we concerned about the social climate? When people say that there isn't a good enough business climate, what they're basically saying, the kind of people who use that phrase, like the Chamber of Commerce and so forth, are saying we need to pay workers less, so jobs don't leave this state for where other states where they are paying workers less. We need to adjust workmen's compensation laws, which admittedly there may be problems with the workmen's compensation system. I know our friend David Johnson thinks that there are. But in any event, I think a better distinction to make would be between a business climate in which corporations are making lots of money and the people are doing poorly, and a social climate in which the people are doing well, in which business would be doing fine, especially if we had a full employment economy, but profits might not be so great. There might not be so many people getting filthy rich. So those are the two comments that I might have made in the woulda, coulda, shoulda category of doing spontaneous interviews with people asking me general questions about my candidacy.
You're watching News from Neptune, the L'Esprit de l'Escalier edition. What I wish I'd said. You got a response to that, Ron?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to ask about. The French have a term for that.
Yeah,
what
exactly.
you say on the stairs as
Yes.
you leave the party, and think of the witty things you should have said.
It's a funny phrase. Apparently, French people don't understand it.
Right.
It was coined apparently by an Englishman. I mean, it means literally the spirit of the stairs, or the idea as defined as you just did. But I'm told, once again, not being French, I don't know. I'm told that if you are a native speaker of French, the phrase doesn't make much sense.
But what I do have another sort of one-liner that I've been saying in response to. I mean, the News Gazette wrote a nice editorial yesterday. They're just loving on me, not because of what I believe, of course, but just the idea that like 3 people are going to run for the state senate, assuming I can get on the ballot, which is not a sure thing, but I'll certainly try. And whenever the news, they take this cynical attitude about politicians, especially obviously Illinois politicians, and they take every opportunity to prove the point that there's just something inevitably, corrupt about the politicians, especially of this state. And even when Republican politicians get into trouble, like former Congressman Aaron Schock, or former Congressman Dennis Hastert, or former Governor George Ryan, they, of course, will use this sort of general blanket statement about, well, these corrupt politicians, what is it about the politicians of this state? But of course, the response I have is that, I think I wrote it on a comments page under one of their articles online, is that, well, no matter how corrupt all Illinois politicians seem to be, the News Gazette's editorial stance is that you still have to vote for the ones with an R next to their name. So, and I think that's something that, in light of their enthusiasm about having actual choices for state senate or any other race, in my case, state senate, their enthusiasm will inevitably be modified by the fact that they will always support the person or man with an R next to his name.
Although you made the point, David, and I think it's true, that the Tom Kasich gave you, I thought, a very straightforward interview and account, and
Yes.
the article that he wrote for that was really quite good.
Mm-hmm.
I had a peculiar experience with people from the News Gazette not all that long ago. I gave a lecture in former Representative Tim Johnson's political science class at the little university down the street. And in that class, Tom Kasich, the editor at the News Gazette, and Jim Dye spoke, did a brother act and spoke to that class before I spoke. So what surprised me after listening to most of what they had to say was that Dye at least sat around to hear what I had to say, at least some of which was a discussion of the Salata case and an attack on the News Gazette and what the News Gazette has done on that matter, and the peculiar circumstances which makes the News Gazette the somewhat leaky vessel for political discussion in Champaign-Urbana. So, you know, at least they stayed and listened. So,
Yeah, one of the remarkable things you can generalize about News Gazette editorials and even some of the purportedly news columns is the daily attacks on Democratic office holders, and especially, of course, Obama and Hillary, and it's absolutely unremitting. It's amazing, but anyway.
Maybe that's why I like them. I'm not sure.
Right.
I did like the question to you, David, about whether your candidacy was going to hurt either major party, and I was reminded.
How would I hurt them?
Well, yes.
How is that even possible?
That's, you take votes which rightfully belong to them.
Right. Yes.
That's the notion.
You know, I get that. I get that.
Well, I don't think it's that so much as votes that otherwise would have gone to them from liberal, lefty inclined people.
But otherwise would have gone. I mean, this presumption that those votes somehow belong to one of the major neoliberal, neoconservative parties seems to me to be worth challenging. But the question itself reminded me of the perhaps because we were talking about sports before we went on the air today. That,
as we always do.
Yeah, wasn't it Casey Stengel who said about a trade, he said, that's a trade that hurts both teams.
Right.
And there's a sense in which your candidacy is a candidacy that hurts both parties.
Well,
more power to you, brother.
Well, we'll see about hurt. I don't think it's going to be the House of Pain exactly.
Or the Legion of Doom.
Yeah.
Well, we can hope.
Yeah.
We can hope. You're watching News from Neptune. Ron, what's top of your list for
Okay, well, last week I had a couple of things to say about civil forfeiture as practiced by the police and how it has put a lot of money into their coffers. Indeed, there was an article in the local paper, Cash of Cash comes in handy on October 18th, about all of the nice things that the police now can buy with money and other goods seized from various citizens, without ever being any finding that anyone was guilty of any crime, or indeed, they don't even have to show that any crime was committed.
Right.
They can just take it and say, well, we suspected them of being involved in some illegal activities, such as drugs or something. So I'll come back to another aspect of this. The thing that's grown up in the legal system, and other people have expressed skepticism about whether such a thing can really be true, and that is under the banner of tort reform. Well, first of all, there's a remarkable rise of, when people are charged with a crime, plea bargaining to get out of it. Most charges now are settled by plea bargaining. You plead guilty to a lesser crime, and you'll get off with a lesser punishment. And or you want to take your chances with a jury, in which case the consequences may be very serious indeed, far more serious than you want to deal with. So, yeah, the whole legal system, I think, has been called into question with this kind of thing. Now, in more and more contracts, on about page 12 or 15, you may look, you may find, if you look hard enough, a phrase about compulsory arbitration. By signing this contract, you may be committed, without knowing it, to, if any dispute, disagreement arises between you and the vendor that you're dealing with, it will be arbitrated by an arbitrator of their choosing, who turns out to be actually directly or indirectly, in reality, one of their employees. So it's remarkable. These things that have got into the contracts that people are signing today, mostly without being aware of it, because who bothers to read all of that legal stuff that goes with, clicking on the I accept button when you get some software or something. And how many people actually read that stuff and bother to think about what its implications are? Now, in more and more contracts, and the corporations have been very successful at this. There are a bunch of creative, shall we say, Wall Street lawyers who have put this over. Non-compete clauses. You're not being allowed to work for anyone else at all in some cases, or in the same line of business for 2 or 3 years after you leave a certain company. Anti-disparagement clauses, meaning you're not allowed to say anything bad or negative about the company that you have worked for, or have been complaining about, or about which you've become a complainant. The non-disclosure clauses that are turning up in a lot of contracts. You can't say anything to anyone about what your former business or activities were, because there might be some trade secrets in there, or something that could be useful to someone else in making more money. Now there are food libel laws, the so-called veggie libel laws, which were in the news there for a while when Oprah made some remarks about beef and what was going into the beef, and that was promptly smacked down by these kind of laws. The ag-gag laws, saying that, well, essentially one of the things that they forbid, and you'll be punished for, is taking videos with your cell phone of animal abuse of cattle and other livestock on farms. There was the pink slime controversy of about 2012 for what they insisted should be called lean, finely textured beef, which was being specified for school lunches and so on. And I'm not sure they ever made references to pink slime, completely illegal, and something you'd be punished by a jail term for, but the pressure became enormous. So what has this done to distort the legal system? Can you really punish someone for saying something about a former employer, for example, or even a present employer, for being a person who, what are they called, says something negative about
slanders
them.
or
yeah,
yes.
well, like our 3 informants about what's going on in the government. But do we need more laws to protect people like that? Well, I think so. But anyway, okay. Second point. What's happening to the American former middle class?
Let's say a word more about this line of
sure.
assets forfeiture and these arbitration agreements. There are ramifications to this that are particularly important even this week. We finally have had revealed most of the text of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and one of the principal elements in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, one of the things that makes it so bad, is this compulsory arbitration of the sort that you talk about, that companies under the Trans-Pacific Partnership can proceed against a government that tries to regulate their activities on the grounds that it violates the TPP, and the issue will then go to an arbitration of the sort that you described. This is one of the most outrageous aspects of the TPP, and an example of the sort of neoliberal substitution of corporate control for even political and governmental regulations.
Yeah, what that does essentially is outlaw class action suits. And that's the only way that ordinary people have of getting any recompense for what the corporations have done, because they typically can't afford to carry on individual legal action against these corporations. That's just out of the question, although they will say formally, legally, it's possible, but of course, in the real world, it's next to impossible to actually do it.
There's another parallel to a decision this week by the essentially the Supreme Court of France that upheld the conviction of a dozen activists in Paris for publicly calling for the boycott of Israeli goods.
Oh, yeah.
This is incredible. I mean, it's remember, we have a perfectly local example of this in the and David's opponent for the Senate seat being one of the local liberal legislatures who refused to vote against a law which required the University of Illinois to remove funds from companies that observed a boycott of Israeli apartheid.
Well, actually, it was at the state level, state corporations invested in by the state pension funds and so forth, regarding their investments in companies that, disinvestment from companies that might observe the Israeli boycott.
But the French decision is even more serious in that it convicted people for speech, for publicly calling for a boycott of Israeli goods.
Well, I'm sure that Charlie Hebdo will be having some comics against that, right?
Well, yeah. You think so?
Yes. I'm being facetious.
But the point that Ron raises is a neoliberal move that reverberates up and down the scale. I mean, from international trade agreements down to local concerns at the University of Illinois and the state of Illinois. So it's these are very serious issues, and it seems to me that it's important to see that as part of a general neoliberal campaign, that these are not just sort of accidental events. They are the at the heart of the neoliberal campaign to make sure that the interests of corporate entities prevail, even over democratic guarantees, rights of free speech, things of that sort. And it is a very serious matter indeed, and it's a matter that's being pushed not sort of accidentally and by the breeze blowing one way or another, but these are active campaigns by American business interests, by American corporations to secure these outrageous rights for themselves.
One has to assume that our law schools are training lawyers to write these things. One has to assume that this is something that begins in law school, the mentality by which one protects corporate rights, what are called corporate rights, in relation to what Noam Chomsky always calls corporate tyrannies, And reinforcing Chomsky's point that the last thing that corporations want is a free market and
Yes.
free choice.
That's
We
a
see
very
all
important point.
all the things that Ron refers to have to do with inhibiting the flow of information from what goes on in corporations to beyond that.
Yeah.
And just to add a couple of points to what you were saying about civil forfeiture and plea bargaining and this sort of thing, I think there's a good article in the New Yorker magazine recently that was passed along to me that I have not read yet, but there's a very good journalist of New Yorker magazine whose name I can't recall right now that I think I will report back on that article. And the whole business with plea bargaining, it's hard for me to believe that doesn't have a lot to do with the war on drugs and just the overwhelming
Absolutely.
processing, the overwhelming numbers of people that have to be processed through the legal system, primarily or at least significantly as a part of the war on drugs. In recent decades, I've seen this process in the little time that I spent observing with some other local citizens about how this goes down in our local courtroom. There's lawyers who specialize in plea bargaining. And a final point would just be that, again, as you said, Ron, any person without means getting mixed up with lawyers, it's like you'll do anything. If you've had any experience with that, if you've heard any stories, you know that your life will be ruined by legal debt. If it's not already being ruined by credit card debt, student debt, medical debt, or whatever, legal debt is getting pulled over for a traffic stop.
Yep.
Put some people into legal debt that they could spend years getting out of.
And on the war on drugs, which is certainly a clear and present danger to all of us in this country and should be opposed across the board, we had just this week the head of the Drug Enforcement Administration in the Obama administration, in the Democratic administration that exists at the moment, saying that the whole notion of medical marijuana is, I quote, a joke. That medical marijuana doesn't exist, that it doesn't have medical benefits, and that people who say so are joking, according to the head of the DEA. So if this is the attitude we have, most people are aware, particularly people who reach our age are aware of plenty of people who have indeed found medical marijuana to be a real help for cancer sufferers and others. But the head of the DEA says that doesn't exist this week.
Yeah,
So-
we've long known that whistleblowers have a tough life ahead of them. There are all kinds of ways of punishing them, even though officially there are laws that are supposed to protect them and so on, but they don't seem to be very effective at all. And if you blow the whistle on some powerful corporate person or politician or whatever, your life can become extremely difficult and in effect be ruined after that. And why does that keep happening? Well, the whole system, according to some, seems rotten from top to bottom.
Well, with that as an introduction, Ron, although we don't rehearse this, but it works nicely for what I want to say. I want to blow the whistle on an old friend, a longtime associate, from a speech that he gave at Dartmouth. Dartmouth is a boys' school in New England. The man in question is named Rand Beers. Randy and I grew up together. And he came to public attention perhaps first when he and Richard Clarke resigned from the White House in 2003 at the time of the invasion of Iraq. They were associated with the White House, actually with the National Security Council, as counterterrorism experts. And their resignation was in opposition to the invasion of Iraq, not because they didn't think it was a good idea to kill people in the Middle East in furtherance of American goals, but that the Bush administration had chosen the wrong people to kill. They should be attacking someone else. They had several candidates. Richard Clark became better known at the 9/11 hearings when he spoke about the preparations or the run-up to 9/11 and the failure of the American counterterrorism establishment, of which he was a most prominent member, to stop the 9/11 attack. He and Randy, as I say, both quit from the White House then. Randy went on to advise John Kerry's presidential campaign and establish a think tank of the neoconservative disposition. I mean, this was not an objection at all to the war policy of the United States, or to put it another way, it was an objection to the way in which the war policy was being carried out, not to the policy itself. And he gave a speech at Dartmouth this last week, invited by military officials associated with Dartmouth. Randy's a Dartmouth graduate. And in that speech, he presented the standard U.S. government propaganda for killing people around the world. I quote, "Russia and China currently pose bigger security challenges than terrorism," close quote. In other words, that we have to be more serious about the Obama administration's provoking war in Eurasia, from Ukraine to the South China Sea, and not be quite so concerned about the Mishigas in the Mideast.
I love that, Mishigas in the Mideast.
That's a contribution of an old friend of mine. It's not Randy's phrase, as a matter of fact.
I love that.
But it does, I think, represent his view. And I think it's important to pay attention to this because not just because somebody I went to school with many years ago, but because he does represent a strain of thinking in American, or the strain of thinking, sorry, I didn't really mean the pun, but it works, in the American political establishment in the world of counterterrorism. Because his assertion in this honored public presentation that Russia and China pose bigger security challenges than terrorism depends upon an understanding of what those security challenges are, or what in fact they are challenging. What they challenge are the world economic hegemony of the U.S. 1%. Not the interests of the majority of Americans, much less the majority of people in the world, but it's the economic interests of that 1% that the government is working for, and the defense of which is the primary concern of the American military, who sponsored this talk on counterterrorism. I started the program by recalling that in the past 50 years, Republican and Democrat administrations alike have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings, mostly civilians, in order to prevent challenges to a world economy dominated by the U.S. elite. And here we have my old friend pointing out that we have to take seriously the real challenge to that economy, and that challenge comes not from a few guys in the Mideast. It comes from the lords of Eurasia, Russia, and China. And I think it's worthwhile for us to recall that, because this represents not a dissident view or even a peculiar view in the American government. It represents the central theme of American military operations around the world for 2 generations. And I was distressed to see my old friend mouthing this propaganda as clearly as he did, even to the unsuspecting students at Dartmouth.
Well, you certainly weren't surprised, were you?
No, not surprised. He stopped answering my emails many years ago.
Okay.
So I mean, this is not I was not shocked at all. It was entirely running true to character.
Yeah, I wanted to get in one point about an old concern of mine that I have to keep returning to, and that is the decline of social and civic morale in this country, which I think is a rather direct consequence of the turn toward neoliberalism that you're talking about.
How do you mean?
in this sense. There were 2 articles in the New York Times on November 2nd and 3rd about by Gina Colada. Surprising jump in death rates seen for middle-aged whites.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a search for causation, which is always difficult and very dubious. But what has led to the apparent despair and disengagement and self-destruction of so many middle-aged white males in particular? And we should have some concern about that.
Yes.
I think.
Close to home.
Yeah, right. The financial situation to many of the men, they're losing their jobs, they're not getting paid as much as they want or need. They're unable to make a living in the way that they thought they had a right to, and the way their parents did. They were told that if they worked hard and played by the rules and so on, they would have a prosperous life and achieve the American dream, and they're finding out again and again in many cases that that's not true. There are student debts, but apart from that, which is mostly college debts, these people mostly didn't go to college, and they have enormous medical bills, for example. There are more personal bankruptcies due to medical bills, apparently, than just about anything else, aside from, well, possibly credit card debt and student debt and so on. So here's this take. Increases in mortality rates for middle-aged whites due to suicide and substance abuse rose in parallel with increasing reports of pain, poor health, and distress. Something startling is happening to middle-aged white Americans. Unlike every other age group, unlike every other racial and ethnic group, unlike their counterparts in other rich countries, death rates in this group have been rising, not falling. Why is this? I mean,
well,
the death rates for blacks and Hispanics are going down,
Yeah.
while
Well,
those...
I doubt if they're going down all that much.
Well, slightly, at least.
But,
yeah.
But no, I've read articles. There was an article on the website Naked Capitalism, which may have referred to that article. I think it was a different article. But yeah, there's been increased suicide rates among middle-aged white men. And what the article on Naked Capitalism was referring to was the decreased participation of white men in the labor force. And in fact, the overall participation of prime working age people in our country in the labor force, I think they call that age 25 to 64, is I think lower, among the lowest or the lowest of any developed countries. So these are definitely aspects of neoliberalism that perhaps we don't, while we're focusing on the drug war and militarism and dire poverty and the younger people getting out of college with their student debt. And it's analogous in a sense to considering the predominance of these mass shootings among white males that we've talked about before on this show. I mean, different populations can respond to these stresses in different ways, and it's conceivable, this is purely hypothetical, but it's conceivable that for a lot of white men, however their feelings of entitlement, whatever they're feeling that they're not having the life that they thought they were going to have, that takes a great toll on them. And in contrast to black men, this is big, generalization and perhaps questionable, but it may be that black men, for all the talk about black men fathering children out of wedlock and so forth, that they're more supported by social networks than some white men who may have their family, and in a lot of cases I think they lose their families, and end up being in a completely different place and not having the social support they need to. And fundamentally, social support, fine. They need jobs. They need lives.
They need income.
One of the people in this article on Naked Capitalism was talking about, well, I used to be an electrician, but after 5 years or whatever of not being one, I couldn't call myself that anymore. I'm not one anymore. I haven't done it for years. So that's, identity and jobs and seeing oneself as a provider, whether that's a male thing, whether that's a cultural thing, it certainly plays itself out.
But it also points up the need for something for which there's practically no political movement at all in this country. That is a guaranteed annual income at the level of a living wage. People deserve that. People have a right to it. And that was taken for granted 40 years ago in the most liberal administration of the late 20th century, the administration of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not very liberal himself, but his administration, because of the social circumstances at the time, was forced to be. Out of which we get things like the Environmental Protection Agency and various and sundry activities that came from a liberal administration. In some ways, their most liberal action was an attempt to establish a guaranteed annual income on the basis of negative income tax. In other words, they wanted to find a way, they called it the Family Assistance Program, that the sort of situation you described, David, would not be the case. That is, people would have access to income, income enough to support them without the need for special programs for special people or for the sneers of Republicans who are going to say people want free stuff. Now, this was the program of the Nixon administration, presided over by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It was essentially shot down by Democrats, but I mean, it was the high watermark in some ways of the sort of social concerns that we need to deal with the issues that we're talking about here. I don't see much of that on the horizon these days, and there should be.
Yeah, well, let me finish off here with death rates are rising for middle-aged white Americans. The mortality rate for whites 45 to 54 years old with no more than a high school education increased by 134 deaths per 100,000 people from 1999 to 2014. Quoting, "It is difficult to find modern settings with survival losses of this magnitude," wrote two Dartmouth economists, Ellen Mira and Jonathan Skinner, in a commentary on the Deaton case analysis that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we have pointed to a problem, made a diagnosis, which you may or may not agree with, about the alienation that seems very common in societies that emphasize individualism and essentially the capitalist notion of grabbing everything you can for yourself and so on, and suggested a possible partial solution also in the annual minimum annual wage kind of idea.
While people are grabbing everything they can for themselves, they're also grabbing it for their children and their grandchildren and making sure that there's no means by which to redistribute wealth, even intergenerationally. So as we discovered in reading Piketty's book and so forth, that that's one aspect of the growing economic inequality in this country. But another aspect that you hint at there is the fact that we don't have a universal health care system. Mm-hmm. People fall through the social safety net. They fail to deal with their medical issues. I mean, there's probably many aspects of this in terms of being marginalized and the health effects of that in and of itself, probably made worse by poor medical care, by people who don't want to go to the doctor because they don't want to find themselves in medical debt. So there's plenty of grist for the mill when it comes to the enormously horrible effects that neoliberalism has had on social life. I guess, Carl, what you raise in terms of the guaranteed annual income, the question is, we might have a society in which people can have a basic living and choose to spend their time doing things that they value. But the question is the balance there between the things, the goods and services that the government should be providing to people, and having jobs that are having well-paid jobs that provide those, and and so again, as I think we've said before, the sort of debate between the job guarantee, the governmental job guarantee versus the guaranteed annual income, and you could probably have both. You could probably do, decent aspects of both of these things, and alleviate the kind of things that Ron's been talking about.
Yeah.
There's the fundamental situation is clear. There's a great deal of work that needs to be done in society, useful work, and there is massive unemployment. We know that the unemployment figures are minimized by the government, for obvious reasons. But given a lot of people who want to work and a lot of work that needs to be done, it's simply a vicious society that's unable to put them together. Because in our society, you put them together only if you pay rich people to do it. That is, you get a job only when it becomes more valuable to your employer to have you work for him or her than not to work for him or her. So it's a situation that is societal. We're tempted always to think of it as individual. Gee, I just wasn't a very good electrician or something, as an example you used. But what we're talking about here is a major social failing, a social failing that, as Ron's study points out, is getting worse. I thought that was interesting, your quotation, Ron, of the authors of your study, that it's hard to find parallels of this rise in death rates amongst this class of citizens. I think there is one great parallel staring us in the face, for which the United States government and society, for which the United States government is largely responsible. And that was the destruction of the Russian economy in the 1990s.
Yeah.
When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the U.S. government, the Clinton administration, moved actively to destroy the Russian economy, which was now no longer able to defend itself with a strong central government. It had the notoriously drunken Boris Yeltsin at the head of the government, and a weak hand on the tiller at best. What the U.S. tried to do was to turn Russia, in this long-going, long-term competition for the control of the Eurasian economy, what the U.S. tried to do in the 1990s was to turn Russia into a third world country, a dependent supplier of raw materials, primarily energy resources, but dependent on foreign capital and foreign control. And indeed, what the Putin regime represents is a rejection of that campaign that the U.S. was actively engaged in throughout the 1990s. And some of the animosity against Putin in Washington grows out of the frustration of the U.S. attempt to destroy the Russian economy. It did have some substantial effects on the economy. The decline in the Russian economy in the 1990s under Western pressure was greater than the decline of the American economy, the U.S. economy during the Great Depression. And that was noted precisely in the area that you were talking about. That is a remarkable rise in the death rate, a shortening of longevity, particularly among males,
Right.
for some of the reasons that you suggest. And it was worked out, as I say, across the board in Russia throughout the 1990s. So the circumstances that you describe in this country have been played out recently in a way that does not reflect credit on our neoliberal government.
Yeah, sometimes pointed to that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the public health system went with it, and there followed then a dramatic decrease in life expectancy in Russia.
Exactly right.
And that's difficult to tell Americans about, because their focus here is always on esoteric high-tech medicine. And but public health measures and preventive measures are far more important in saving large numbers of lives and increasing life expectancy than all of these high-tech things that we keep hearing about that apparently are going to be practiced by the new University of Illinois Carl convergence with the medical school and the engineering departments and so on.
So you don't think that the new medical school is a game changer?
No, no. Well, not for most
For
people.
some people's games.
Yeah.
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 So let me just finally mention two contrasting articles about this. Here is on November 1st, Scott Burns in the local daily, Why We Need a Healthcare Revolution. He says that it is now almost impossible for working people to educate their children and accumulate enough money to retire. You can't get there from here. How do I see such a global conclusion in a report on healthcare costs? Follow the numbers. The headline number is in the report is that a 65-year-old couple can expect to spend $245,000 on healthcare before they both die. That's up $25,000 from last year, an increase of 11%. Yes, you read that right. Up 11% in the period of low or no inflation, and so on. So it goes on in this vein that we've reached a completely untenable situation. By contrast, in this morning's New York Times, there is a article by David Brooks with a soothing message saying that the healthcare situation is resolving itself. It's looking better and better, and so on. And given a moment, I can find the article itself, but I guess we can't wait for that.
That's fine. Look for it. This is important. Yeah. Resolving itself for people like David Brooks.
Yes.
He's not having any trouble. He doesn't understand why other people are.
Right, right.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. While you're looking, Ron, and as I say, I think this is important, I want to round out what I was saying earlier about my old friend Rand Beers and his associate Richard Clark. The two of them, as I mentioned, resigned from the Bush White House because they didn't like the way the war in the Middle East was going. They wanted to kill other people from the ones the Bush people were killing. But Clark was surfaced himself last week on the program Democracy Now! And it was rather interesting because he talked about how much more vicious the Obama administration's war in the Middle East was than the one that he approved of. And it's worthwhile reading a brief paragraph of what Richard Clark said. He says, the Bush administration and then the Obama administration, sorry, let me say that differently. The Bush administration is succeeded by the Obama administration. You have a kill committee, people who sit around in the White House passing folders back and forth of names and voting on whom they're going to kill. I just find that it went way too far. This is Richard Clark, Richard Clark, who was busily talking about people who should be killed to the Bush White House. If any of us back in the Clinton administration, he was a member of the Clinton administration before, if any of us back in the Clinton administration would have imagined that in the same room, in the same chairs a few years later, people would be sitting around with a long list and folder with pictures and names of people and voting on who would live and who would die, I think we might never have authorized the first use of lethal force against bin Laden, close quote. Well, there's a certain disingenuity, I think, at stake here in these counterterrorism experts who are busily trying to find the real threats to the 1% in this country. But the notion that the Obama administration, which came into office with the votes of anti-war people in the United States, has in fact made the war a good deal more vicious, that seems correct. And we have it, as it were, straight from the horse's mouth here, the leading counterterrorism expert. So it seems to me it's important that we begin to realize what the real policy of the United States is, regardless of whether the Republicans or Democrats in the office, and indeed how it has become increasingly vicious in recent years as the war in the Middle East has continued to turn bad. We now have a worldwide assassination campaign presided over by a man who was elected as a peace candidate. That should give us pause.
Well,
I found it.
Find David Brooks?
By contrast, Headline, great news, we're not doomed to soaring healthcare costs, according to David Brooks. He says it really matters who the next president is, but there are other things that matter just as much to the nation's future prosperity. One of them is what is happening to healthcare costs. If healthcare costs start to rise again the way they did before, then healthcare spending will swallow the economy and bankrupt the federal government. If they're contained, then there's suddenly a lot more money for everything else, and so on.
Well, I know that Dean Baker has been pointing out that Medicare costs have been rising less quickly than they were predicted to have risen, so that is, and he's saying, using that as a way of tamping down all the scare tactics. But of course, underneath all that is all the issues that have to do with the fundamental nature of the healthcare system in this country, the pharmaceutical, the health insurance, pharmaceutical, how much we pay doctors, all those things that, I mean, there's just no reason for our healthcare to cost at least 50% as much per person to not cover everyone in this country as in other countries that have universal health care.
The most recent numbers, Brooks says, have indicated a scary surge in healthcare prices, and some firms are projecting a 6.5% inflation for 2016. While parts of the law reduce spending, other parts may lead to more spending, especially as the industry gets more concentrated and so on. The weight of the evidence suggests that part of the change is permanent. Moving away from the bad old fee-for-service system has got to be a good thing. The greater pressures providers feel to reduce costs have got to be a good thing, at least fiscally, and so on. So there's a reassuring tone to this. Despite what Scott Burns says, we're headed for disaster, David Brooks says, well, things are looking up. It's not so bad.
I hope you're reassured.
Right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 45th week of 2015, a Daddy Didn't Do It edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. See our Facebook page for News from Neptune, and the blog newsfromneptune.com is back up after a long absence. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.